Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is David Listen, and this is my first video on my new channel focusing more on Buddhism, strictly on Buddhism and Buddhist practice. And for today's video, I'd like to talk about how to learn Buddhism with a more systematic approach. In contrast to trying to learn Buddhism by just reading a little bit here, reading a little bit there, watching a video, doing some meditation in a more scattered, less focused, less organized way. So, firstly, I'd like to start with talking about the purpose of Buddhist practice. So, if you're considering learning about Buddhism, you're not sure if you're ready to invest so much time in it, it's important to know right off what is the purpose of this practice. And if your own values align with it, then you'll likely feel more comfortable to make a commitment to it and engage in some form of systematic study. So the purpose of Buddhism is for understanding and resolving suffering and experiencing what we could describe as true joy, true happiness. True in contrast to a kind of happiness which we could say is false or conditioned, where we're happy sometimes based on a certain situation, then unhappy at other times. That's conditioned happiness. True happiness doesn't depend on anything, doesn't depend on anything external to us, but it's a potential to experience an inherent joy and happiness based on what? Based on what is called wisdom, inherent wisdom, or our capacity to see clearly ourselves and the world, and our integration with the world. There are different terms that describe this kind of insight, and I'll talk about that later. But the purpose is to realize this capacity for wisdom that we have, which releases us from suffering. And when we're released from suffering, we also have this capacity to be compassionate, to be aware of the needs of others, and to respond to that in a skillful way. So the practice of Buddhism is not just for yourself or for oneself, but the grander purpose is to benefit all beings, all people, and on a broader scale, all living beings. Because if we look at the bigger picture, all of us, all human beings, all living beings, and technically non-living beings, we're all part of this totality, this grand ecosystem of life. So when we benefit, everyone benefits. So what does Buddhist practice actually entail? Buddhist practice has three main studies. They're called the three learnings. But it's not just an intellectual learning. It's a complete practice. So the main practices of Buddhism are discipline, what's translated often as concentration. I like to use the word stability, referring to stability of mind, and wisdom. The Chinese are 戒, 定, 慧. I'll talk about concentration first, because this is often the most attractive for people who hear about Buddhism, which is, meditation. This concentration or mental stability that we develop in meditation, it's helping us develop equanimity, meaning that our mind is becoming more and more calm and less disturbed by things, whether it's internal experience or some external stimulus. Meditation practice begins with concentrating the mind and developing a concentration that's minimizing distracting thoughts and can develop into a concentration which is better described as absorption, where the mind can be so concentrated, so internally absorbed, that it's unaware of the external environment, but completely aware of our internal experience. And that more internal absorption of the mind is often referred to as the 4 dhyana and 8 samadhi. Again, that term samadhi refers to this equanimity of mind, stability, ongoing stability of mind. The Chinese is 四禅八定. So concentration can develop to a point where there's not only concentration, but if a person has wisdom, in this state of absorption, one can also experience the liberation of the mind, the releasing of all attachment. And that's what's called the 9th samadhi, or the experience of absorption where thought and sensation have stopped. We could say all the coarse mental functions and even the subtle mental functions have stopped, even thought or sensation at any level. Of course, this is a very absorbed state where the person's just sitting there. They're still alive, but the mind is not functioning at all, other than the awareness of being alive, the awareness of the body still being alive. Although there may not be an awareness of the feeling of the body, the person knows there's life there. This is a samadhi, or an absorption, only realized by people who are liberated. And this is not something easy at all to achieve. So, although it's easy to talk about, it's not at all something easy to achieve, but it's worth mentioning. In later Buddhism, there's another samadhi which is called the Mahayana Samadhi, or sometimes it's called the Shou Leng Yin San Mei, the kind of most supreme Shurangama Samadhi, which is a reference to a teaching of the Buddha. In this samadhi, all mental functions are actually present and happening. There's seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. There's also thought, potential for thought, mental activity of all kinds. The difference is that self-attachment is gone. Suffering is gone. But the person can be fully active and engaged in daily life, engaging with people, engaging with situations, and responding with wisdom and compassion. This kind of samadhi is described as the concentration of the Buddha, where the mind is stable and unmoving in all kinds of situations. In the Platform Sutra of the 6th ancestor master in the Chan tradition, the Liu Zu Tan Jing, this is what's called the Yixing San Mei, or the samadhi of one practice, or one approach to developing mental stability, which is the practice in all situations of being aware of internally, externally what's happening, and yet being able to let go of all attachment. So this samadhi of one practice is something that we can apply in daily life, in all situations. Even if we haven't realized it fully, in the Chan tradition, this Yixing San Mei points out that in all these situations we can still practice, we can still develop mental stability and clarity, and cultivate these aspects of wisdom and compassion. So meditation practice itself can be done alone. But if a person only knows a little bit about the method, how to sit there and maybe follow one's breathing, but one doesn't know about the theory behind the method, the process of practice, and what can happen along the way, if we don't know about these things and we don't have guidance, it can be very difficult to even have the most basic kind of concentration. So that's why it's important to have a map of the practice. And this is actually corresponds to the next aspect of Buddhist practice, wisdom, or 智慧. Wisdom is this overall map of Buddhist practice. It's the map of meditation. It's the map of the basic principle of how to go from suffering to liberation from suffering. And it also includes a map of discipline, a way to live our daily lives in a healthy way that minimizes harm and maximizes benefit. So wisdom can be an intellectual kind of knowledge. Chinese, it's called 文字般若. 般若 refers to 智慧. 般若 is a translation of prajna, which means wisdom in Sanskrit. It can be conceptual, based on words and language, so that reading instructions on meditation, reading and learning about the principles of how to live wisely, we accumulate knowledge and it helps give us direction. This is intellectual wisdom, and it's useful. It's essential, actually. This can then lead to a second kind of wisdom, or the wisdom of observation. 观照般若. And the wisdom of observation is the process of practicing, the process of using a clear mind, a stable mind, to observe ourselves and the world. This observational wisdom can then lead to what's called real wisdom, or the wisdom of reality, 实相般若. And this just refers to an insight, not an intellectual understanding, but an experiential insight into the reality of impermanence, the reality that all forms, all formations, as it's said, all things are impermanent. Because they're impermanent, there's no fixed self. Described in a more comprehensive way, everything is empty, from the largest to the smallest thing. Not one single thing has its own self-nature. Everything is just a product of causes and conditions. This real wisdom, or wisdom of reality, liberates us from suffering. When we can see how things truly are, then we don't create suffering because of seeing things how they're not, seeing things as permanent, seeing things as separate selves, isolated selves. This wisdom is what truly liberates a person from suffering. So these above two aspects of Buddhist practice are probably the most attractive ones: meditation, or developing mental stability, and wisdom. But we have to remember that these practices won't be successful without the foundation of the third practice, discipline. Discipline, or 戒律, precepts and discipline, refer to living in a way that minimizes harm and maximizes benefit. When I say maximizing benefit, it refers to maximizing one's chance to be liberated from suffering and to minimize or help other people also be relieved of their suffering. Minimizing harm refers to, more obviously, minimizing the pain and discomfort that we and others could experience from unskillful behavior. and to maximize the experience of freedom and ease of our body and mind based on skillful ways of living. So we're basically learning to not do things that disturb ourselves and others, and that maintains the health of our body and mind. 5 basic practices of discipline are called the 5 precepts, or 5戒, which are a basic ethical code of behavior, which include not to kill, steal, lie, have sexual misconduct, which basically refers to not having affairs or promiscuous, unhealthy sexual relationships, and not to have intoxicants, which we can get into. I think that deserves a video in itself. How Buddhism's unique aspect of ethical code includes to not intake or to not use intoxicants or intoxicating substances. There are advanced precepts called the Bodhisattva precepts, 菩萨戒, for a person who wants to be more proactive in living in a way that's compassionate and considerate of the suffering and the sensitivity of all sentient beings. The Bodhisattva precepts are much more proactive in that they give us guidelines for not only what not to do, but what to do to minimize harm, maximize benefit, maximize everyone's potential for ability for liberation, freedom from suffering. Then there are the strictest precepts within Buddhism, which are for Buddhist monastics, monks and nuns, who adopt a way of living that intentionally abandons or renounces any kind of behavior that could potentially increase one's craving, especially. And of course, leaving and abandoning behavior that can lead to anger as well as more ignorance. So this includes vows of celibacy, poverty, and restrictions on food and possessions. These are basically some of the most basic things that we crave the most for: food, power, sex, money, wealth, material wealth. Monastics minimize and omit these behaviors to minimize the craving and disturbance in the mind. So these precepts are specific for Buddhist monks and nuns and people who are about to enter the monastic life. There are other categories of a practitioner which we won't discuss here, and there are special precepts or special guidelines for those people. But discipline also includes not only just precepts or ethical code, but structured living, or a well-regulated, balanced lifestyle that allows us to have a healthy body and mind so that we can engage in the practice diligently. So how can we actually progress on the study and practice of these 3 aspects of Buddhist practice: discipline, stability, and wisdom? In my opinion, it's best to have a teacher and a community. Well, if we want to really invest in something and learn something deeply, doesn't it make sense to learn from people who are already deeply invested in it and well practiced? When we learn from a teacher, this is a person who's a professional, so to speak, or someone who's devoted their life to the practice. When we learn from a community, we learn from a large group of people, A large group could be a small group of 4 people, maybe 4 or 5 or 10 people. But to have a larger community, there's a benefit to practicing in a large group because there are more people to learn from. And from another angle, there are more people to reflect back to us. The more that we engage with people who are practicing and self-aware, we can see ourselves more easily when we're faced with a person who is genuine and sincere and who sees us clearly. To be in the presence of a person whose mind is calm and clear, and they're just listening to us attentively as we speak, as well as engaging. But when someone listens to us deeply, and you may have had this experience yourself, we can actually start to hear ourselves, hear how we speak, and hear or be more aware of what we're thinking, how we think, and overall be more self-aware of our thoughts, speech, and behavior. So practicing in a community is very powerful and beneficial because we have this support from many people who are on the same path. But it's important to remember that teachers are human. They're not saints. They're not perfect. And if they tell you they're saints, I would keep far away. If the teacher says they're perfect and flawless, claims to be a Buddha, claims to be enlightened, I would stay far away from that teacher. Because usually teachers who claim that they're saints have some motive for saying so. Why would they tell you they're perfect? For those teachers who are saints, I think they wouldn't have any reason to tell anyone. It's their business, or it's their insight. So it's important to remember that teachers are humans, and that as long as they understand the principles of Buddhism and lead a basically ethical life, of course they'll make mistakes, but as long as it's a basic, healthy way of living, and that they understand the principles of Buddhism, we can learn a lot from them. And if they learn from their mistakes, if they share how they learn from their mistakes, I would say they're even more reliable because they're willing to be vulnerable and show their humanity. And communities aren't perfect either. All communities have problems. So if you go looking for a community and you see these problems here and there, you don't like this, you don't like that, I would say just remember that where there are people, there are problems. That goes for lay people in the Buddhist community, and it also goes for monastics. Monastics have their problems. And so if you see this, I would say as long as it's not very big problems, problems that can cause great harm to people, and it's more minor issues or just conflicts of ideas, but as long as the community is willing to work on these problems, and as long as we see that people are treating each other with compassion, even in the midst of argument or conflict, that's a good sign that it's a mature community. A community that's willing to discuss the problems in the open and resolve them together in a respectful and compassionate way. I would say that if you see that kind of community, that's a reliable community. For those of you who don't have the opportunity to study with a community, it's okay. You can still practice alone based on the principles I'm about to share. But I still recommend to check in with a teacher, even if you don't have physical proximity to close physical proximity to a community. With the internet, with telephone calls, you can still reach out to an experienced teacher to get some feedback on your practice, to help you check your understanding, your view of the practice, as well as your use of the method or methods as well. If you don't practicing alone can result in trouble. I've met people in the past who were practicing in isolation, either on some form of solitary retreat or just long-term isolation, and I found that they got into trouble, meaning they got into mental trouble. They had psychological problems because of the way they were practicing, because of their view. So it can be dangerous if a person invests themselves deeply in something, but they're going about it in an unskillful way. So be careful if you're practicing on your own, and try to have some contact with the teacher and community at some point. So let's first talk about the practice of developing mental stability. Often this is done through meditation, sitting meditation, walking meditation, various other practices, even like copying sutras. Many people who can write in Chinese especially can use calligraphy as a way to concentrate the mind. I think this would be great if we developed our calligraphy in English, and we had more newer Buddhist calligraphy in English, kind of like Thich Nhat Hanh's calligraphy, which is beautiful. This is also a practice of concentration. But if we want to truly develop mental stability, in my opinion, it requires dedication to a consistent meditation practice every day. Whether you start with 5 minutes a day just to get into it, that's fine. But it has to be consistent. And I think it has to be daily. Eventually daily. In the beginning, if you feel that you just can't commit to a daily meditation practice, okay. But really ask yourself. You can brush your teeth every day. You can shower every day. Well, I guess that depends. You most likely eat every day. And you spend time on these things because they're essential for your physical hygiene and health. What about our mental health? What about our capacity for wisdom and insight? Doesn't that require dedication? Doesn't that require consistency? So that's why I think daily meditation practice, from 5 minutes in the beginning to 40 minutes to even an hour, if you have that time. Many people sit twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. But whatever time you can commit to, it's important to have that consistent daily sitting meditation practice. It's important also to do meditation retreat, whether that's a 1-day retreat or a 10-day retreat, or in between a weekend retreat. It's important to have these periods of more intensive practice throughout the year. So I'd recommend going at least once a year to start. And if you can, eventually going once every couple of months for a weekend, maybe once a month for a 1-day retreat, once every couple of months for a weekend retreat, once a year for a week-long or longer retreat. And of course, if you have the opportunity to go to a week-long twice a year, that's, I think, wonderful. In addition to going to retreats and practicing under a teacher and with a community, to have your own buddy system where you practice with a group of people more regularly, once a week, to have a group practice with even a handful of people is a very supportive, powerful thing. So if you have a nearby practice center that you can go to, that's great. If you don't, what about a meditation buddy or group of buddies who either sit together in person or sit together online weekly? Next, we can integrate mindful practices into our daily life, such as doing things more mindfully, doing things with more awareness, and first choosing specific activities that we would do daily more mindfully, such as brushing our teeth with full awareness, doing the dishes, going for a walk, doing chores. You can first choose one activity, but then gradually integrate this mindful way of being into all activities of daily life. So it's important to not divide our attention, because we often, I think it's safe to say that many of us divide our attention throughout our whole day, meaning what we call multitasking is actually a scattered attention. We're attending to one thing, and then the next moment we're attending to something else, trying to do two things at once or three things at once because we think it will save time. Or many people that I work with say that they just want to listen to this podcast and they don't have enough time in the day to sit down and sit for 30 minutes for this podcast and then sit for another 30 minutes and just listen intently to a podcast. So they listen while they walk, they listen while they drive, they listen while they do the dishes. And I've done it myself, but that's dividing our attention. It's actually scattering our mind so that if we're listening to a podcast while doing the dishes, we're not really doing the dishes. We have partial awareness of doing the dishes and partial piecemeal awareness of the podcast we're listening to. So you're not absorbing the content of the podcast well, and you're not washing the dishes well. This divided attention just disturbs our mind and actually doesn't bring much benefit. We get a little bit of information, but we also don't get a deep impression because our mind is so divided and scattered. So not dividing our attention is a way to integrate mindfulness into our daily life, and whatever we're doing, just do that. If we live in this way, fully aware of what we're doing, fully aware of the task at hand, fully aware of engaging with people, we start to become much more aware of our reactions and much more aware of our patterns of craving or aversion or our rigid fixation to our views. When we can do that, we can gradually let go of our self-centered reactivity to everything, and still respond, but to respond in a way which has an open awareness to the situation and the ability to see what's good for the situation, what's good for everyone involved, what's the wise and compassionate thing to do. The more we practice, the more we can naturally respond in that way. And as I mentioned, it's important with meditation to check in with a teacher. The practice of meditation can result in a lot of different really unique, not ordinary experiences of our body and mind. So it's important that you can check in with a teacher and don't just evaluate yourself. Don't just look at a Buddhist teaching and say, oh yeah, that was what I experienced. Oh yes, that's the second level of dhyana. Or, oh yeah, that's probably the eighth samadhi. That's very dangerous to evaluate yourself based on your own limited experience. So to check in with a teacher, you can get a much better idea of what you're going through and then how to progress. And if through meditation you think you're enlightened, you're not. That's important to get clear. If you think you're enlightened, you think you got it, you're not. So it's important to just continue the practice. No matter what you experience, just continue. Even if it is a genuine experience of insight or wisdom, if you really are excited about it, you want to tell everyone about it, and you want to get confirmed or validated by a teacher, that's a good sign that it wasn't, or most likely wasn't, genuine insight. Because genuine insight is letting go of self-attachment, letting go of the concern for yourself, letting go of wanting to become something, letting go of the idea of wanting to be enlightened. So if you have this motivation to be recognized, that's a clear sign that self-attachment is still there and very strong. What about the practice of wisdom, or 智慧? So with wisdom, it's important to study, to listen, and to reflect on the teachings of Buddhism. So, of course, we can read. There's plenty of books and literature, listen to lectures and videos. And when we reflect on what we've heard, it's important not just to think about it, but to really internalize what we've heard. So that one practice which I do when I read is that I may read a brief passage or read a paragraph and then put the book down. Just pause and observe myself. Observe my experience at this moment. Quietly observe to see if what I just read is something that I can experience. And if it's something that I can't yet experience, to still observe myself and how those words that I just read, or how what I have just heard, how it's resonating with me. This is a way of reflecting on the teachings which is not only intellectual, but it's more experiential, using the words as a guide to apply in our practice of this moment, to apply in our practice of living. So wisdom begins with reading, begins with thinking, begins with organizing the teachings that we've heard. But we have to remember it's to be used in combination with our method of practice, what I just mentioned before about being mindful, as well as using the method of sitting meditation. If wisdom or the knowledge of Buddhism is not applied in a method, or it's not applied in our daily life, then it's just plain knowledge. We just accumulate knowledge which doesn't have much benefit at all. The knowledge of Buddhism is meant to be applied. So we need to remember that this is not just studying the teachings for the sake of academics or for the sake of being able to show people that we're knowledgeable, but it's for the sake of resolving our suffering. Studying the Dharma is for the sake of helping others resolve their suffering as well. So it can help to take notes and organize what you've read or organize what you've heard, either in the moment of reading and listening, as well as after you've read and learned for a period of time. Say you finish a book, to sit down and map out what you've learned. Sit down and organize, and I find it helpful for myself to organize in terms of using an outline, using a visual map, to use keywords and phrases to simplify and consolidate all that you've read in a book or a particular teaching, and to summarize it. That process of organizing and summarizing what we've learned is a very powerful tool to help us have an even deeper impression of what we've learned. It can help to start by studying and learning broader topics and then becoming more focused. So, for example, the basics of Buddhism, or the broader way to study Buddhism, is, well, in terms of studying the discourses of the Buddha, to start with the Agamas, or the Nikayas, which is a collection of sutras or discourses of the Buddha that emphasize the foundation of Buddhist practice, the foundation concepts, which I just mentioned before: impermanence, selflessness, emptiness, nirvana. These basic concepts and principles are very much prominent in the Agamas. This collection of teachings is often referred to as the foundational teachings. It also includes the Eightfold Noble Path, the 12 links of dependent origination, of which dependent origination is the core of all Buddhist teachings. So it's presented in a very simple form in the Agamas, or the Nikayas, whereas in later Mahayana Buddhism, as Buddhism evolved and developed, teachings appeared, discourses from the Buddha, or some people believe that it wasn't the Buddha who actually spoke these discourses, but later people kind of built upon the basics of Buddhism and created these new teachings. That's an interesting argument, actually, because all of the Buddha's discourses, we can argue, were not spoken directly by the Buddha. Why? Well, because we know that Buddhism was an oral tradition for 400 to 500 years, roughly, before the teachings were actually written down. 500 years after the Buddha passed away, the teachings were written down. So 500 years of oral tradition, I'm sure there was a lot of change to the content as people remembered it differently, as they added their own experience, and after things were written down as well. Things develop as they're written, copied, and passed on. Everything is always developing, having more added to it or some taken away. It's just a natural process of the evolution of information. So for those people who are wondering, is Mahayana Buddhism really what the Buddha said? Well, you can reflect on nothing was exactly what the Buddha said. But we can be confident that the core of the Buddha's teachings are there. Impermanence, selflessness, nirvana, emptiness. These core teachings were then developed and expanded upon. So in the Mahayana Sutras and commentaries, such as school of thinking, which is referred to as consciousness only, school of thought, which refers to emptiness, school of thought, which refers more to Buddha nature. These three main streams of thought within the Mahayana Buddhism expand upon the teaching of dependent interorigination in their own unique way, from their own angle. And I'd like to do another video based on just these three systems of thought. You can first, again, study the foundation of the Agamas, the Nikayas, then later the Mahayana texts and teachings, and read a few sutras that correspond to the teachings of consciousness only. Read a few sutras or commentaries based on emptiness, a few based on Buddha nature. Because all of these teachings have value, that they can help us to understand ourselves and understand our suffering and resolve it. So I think to have a mature view of these teachings can be helpful, to know that they developed over time, they expanded over time. But if we look at them closely and then look at them as a whole, they all share these core values and views. And I think it's useful to read the original, or we can say the discourses of the Buddha just as they are, and then read commentaries by both ancient teachers and modern teachers to help you understand the language, especially if you're reading it in Chinese. Many Chinese speakers find it's quite difficult to read the classical texts, especially Buddhist texts that have a lot of technical language. And even folks who are reading them in English or other languages, it can be challenging because of the technical language as well as the difficulty in translating it in a very fluid and accessible way. It may be difficult for us to grasp. So to have the commentaries of modern teachers can also be very useful. And it's important to remember that all of these words, all of these concepts that we study on this path of Buddhist practice, the concepts are just guides. They're just like a map. We need to use these concepts in our life to observe ourselves, to live more wisely. If we're going to use the Dharma like a map, then we walk, or we go on the journey, or we hike. The map is just a reference. We need to really immerse ourselves in the hike or in the journey. So it's important to remember that true wisdom is something that's alive, something that we realize. It's not just these dead words. The Buddha said that the Dharma is like medicine. It's medicine to cure the illness of the mind. We take too much medicine or we don't use the medicine in the right way, we can make ourselves more sick. So it's important to study skillfully, to also receive guidance from people who understand the teachings, and to apply them in our life. To discuss discipline, or jie. Discipline, as I mentioned, the basic ethical code of Buddhism is not to kill, steal, lie, have affairs or sexual misconduct, and not to take intoxicants. As a Buddhist or non-Buddhist, just someone who's interested in the study of Buddhism but is not sure about committing, we encourage everyone to take all these precepts and live an ethical, healthy life, but for some people in some situations, they're not able to uphold these behaviors, whether it's because of business, they need to drink alcohol, maybe they're a soldier, so they have to engage in war. So for these special circumstances, a person cannot uphold a certain precept, but when they get the chance, they can then take it up again and live in that ethical way to protect themselves and to protect others. But what if we mess up? What if we make mistakes, and what if we cause harm by what's called breaking the precept? Breaking the precept sounds heavy, but it just means we've made a mistake. We've harmed ourselves and harmed others. What do we do? Are we sinners? Are we damned? No. In Buddhism, we can just reflect and reform. We reflect on ourselves and introspect. We realize the mistake that we've made. We realize the harm that we've caused. And we reform to not do it again. We reform to protect ourselves, to protect the well-being of everyone. So Buddhism has a very forgiving attitude towards its practitioners, because that's compassion. Learning to forgive ourselves when we make mistakes, even when we want to do something wholesome, we don't want to do something unwholesome. When we make mistakes, if we can forgive ourselves, we can just reform and continue on the path. So for those who want to make a commitment to an ethical living, I encourage you to take up the 5 precepts. if you have the opportunity, the Bodhisattva precepts, those more advanced ethical practices, wise, compassionate practices are available. And usually monastic communities will hold a ceremony or hold a series of classes about the Bodhisattva precepts, and you can take them and further develop your compassion. For those of you who don't live near any monastic communities, there are some lay communities who transmit the 5 precepts and Bodhisattva precepts. You can do a search and find in your area if there are such places and such ceremonies where you can take up this practice. And if you haven't yet taken the precepts, the one principle of discipline is just to always reflect on our behavior. Reflect and recognize our bad habits. What bad habits do we have? What areas could we improve upon so that we do less of what creates harm and more of what creates wholesomeness and benefit? And strive to minimize the unwholesome and maximize the wholesome. This practice of discipline, this practice of a wholesome way of living, which reduces craving, reduces our anger, reduces our mental scatteredness and cloudiness. This is the practice of relieving ourselves of suffering. Just by practicing discipline, we're already relieving ourselves of the coarser layers of suffering and what we often call vexation in the tradition of Chan, Fan Nao. Practicing a disciplined, ethically sound, and healthy way of living really reduces a lot of coarse vexations and disturbances of body and mind. And one way to have this stable and disciplined way of life is to create a structure, create a plan for yourself, something concrete. Not just saying, oh yeah, I'll live in a disciplined way, yeah, I'll be wholesome, but really design something, starting from a schedule. How do you live your day-to-day life? Or how do you live your week-to-week? I'm sure there's some kind of rhythm that each one of you has, so that when you find that healthy rhythm, how to live your day, when to sleep, when to eat, when to exercise, when to work, when to rest, when to socialize, when to have leisure, when to study the Dharma, when to do your meditation, when to go on retreats. Have a clear plan. And in this way, we're actually planning our year, not just a vacation where we go to have fun, but where we have our retreats, which is also a kind of fun, just a calmer kind of fun, where we reflect deeply on ourselves. Having a clear structure and clear plan will be much more likely to execute it and act in a way that goes along with what we value. So it's important to have this structure, but it's again important to have a structure that takes care of ourselves and takes care of others who we're responsible for. So some people on their path of Buddhist practice can be a bit extreme, especially in the beginning, but they want to do so much meditation, so much Dharma study, even volunteering at a community, that they may forget their responsibilities at home. They may forget, either intentionally or unintentionally, ignore the people closest to them, their spouses, partners, children, to the point where their family may start to hate that they're studying Buddhism. Because mom's studying Buddhism, she's never at home. Or dad's now studying Buddhism, he's always locked up in his office, just reading and meditating. We need to have a balanced approach to our personal practice, which includes others. This is the practice of compassion, including others in our practice so that everyone benefits from it. So, unless we're academics, we also want to have a balance of how much we study and how much we read so that we don't have an overload of information and so that we're applying it in our daily lives. And unless you're a monastic, it's probably not so likely or not possible to take or to attempt to abide by the monastic precepts, such as celibacy, where maybe some people can do that if they're a lay person, but maybe it's not so healthy or not so beneficial for a lay person, especially if you're engaged in a relationship, to all of a sudden say, okay, now I'm going to be celibate. What is your partner going to think of that? Are they going to be happy with you if all of a sudden you decide to be celibate, but they're not? If for lay people, two people are engaged in Buddhism and they really want to be so diligent that they give up sexual activity, that can be a practice when both people have that consensus. But just be mindful that if you already have a partner and you're sexually active, and that's an important part of your relationship, and which it usually is an important part of a balanced, intimate relationship, don't attempt to follow monastic precepts. Follow the lay precepts in a pure and diligent way, and if it comes to a point where you can be celibate and so your partner can as well, that you can minimize your use of money, which I wonder if that's even possible as a lay person, but you can minimize your possessions, simplify your life by managing your wealth skillfully, minimizing useless or frivolous possessions, as well as having a simpler life so that you have more time to focus on the things that you value, especially aspects of Buddhist practice that need more time, such as meditation and study or community practice. For people who want to have more time to do retreat, it's important for them to find work that allows for vacation. They have enough vacation to do these longer retreats. So if you really value engaging in some of these more intensive practices, then you may want to consider arranging your work or finding work that allows flexibility to do these practices. But of course, it's all based on what you value and how you approach the practice. I'd like to also mention briefly that it's important to take care of our bodies. Within the Buddhist tradition, there isn't too much talk of taking care of the physical body, well, at least in the traditions that I've learned from, which are the Chinese Chan tradition. There's not much talk of exercise. As modern people, we think of exercise as a basic activity to maintain physical and mental well-being. But it's important to remember that in the Buddhist tradition, it's transmitted by monastics. And Buddhist monastics, if we look at the Chinese Buddhist tradition, Buddhist monastics for hundreds of years were farming. They were working in the fields every day. They were also building or rebuilding their own monasteries, or they were traveling, walking on foot for hundreds of miles. We go back to the Buddha's time. Every day to have a meal, the monks and nuns had to walk down the mountain into the city or into the communities and beg for alms. So they were walking every day up and down the mountain, holding their bowls, which can become quite heavy. So in all of these monastic traditions, there was no concept of exercise. at least not until more recently. But actually, I take that back, because even in the early days of the Chan tradition with Bodhidharma, it was said that Bodhidharma transmitted a kind of yoga to the Shaolin temple. Later, it was said that Bodhidharma transmitted Kung Fu. But in my opinion, I don't think that that historical record is so accurate. Bodhidharma, coming from India, likely shared his yoga practice. It may have had some martial components, but it was likely that the martial arts of the local area around Shaolin Temple were combined with the physical training of yoga that Bodhidharma shared, and the monastics trained their bodies and kept their bodies healthier and stronger this way, so that they could do the work of meditation and do the work of sharing the teachings with people, with the lay community. There's also other components to the history of Shaolin, but apart from that Buddhist monastery, which is only one, monastics do have practices to take care of the body, whether it was by need, where they had to farm and build their temples or walk, or by design, where the monastics began to train the bodies just enough so that the body is healthy and strong. It's important for lay practitioners to do that as well. So I suggest that all of you have some form of exercise, whether it's just walking or simple calisthenics, but resistance training can benefit our bodies very much so. And maybe I'll share another video of how we can apply the Dharma or apply meditative practices to exercise. And it's also important to not watch too many videos. So although there's a lot to learn, we need to take bite-sized pieces and set aside time to learn, to watch videos, to listen to podcasts. And again, not to overwhelm ourselves with too much information, but have a balanced routine of study so that we can absorb all of these teachings on discipline, developing mental stability, and wisdom, and so that we can study in a way which is sustainable and not overwhelming. So in conclusion, this is a basic, systematic way of approaching the study of Buddhism as a whole, where we have the three basic practices, the three learnings of Buddhism: discipline, samadhi, or mental stability, and wisdom. And we need structure in how we go about these three learnings. We need structure, we need a clear plan for ourselves, and we also need support from other people. We need support from living examples of the Buddha Dharma, not just books and words. Books, words are dead. If we have the support from living people, it can really help us on our path of practice. This path of studying Buddhism is a lifetime, if not more, of practice. So it needs a kind of aspiration or really strong determination to make a commitment to understanding ourselves deeply, understanding how we suffer, understanding how we can resolve suffering, so that we can understand and experience how to bring that same benefit to other people. So this requires determination, consistent practice, and we can benefit from having a vow, clearly telling ourselves or setting up this aspiration for, what do I want to do with this practice? What's the ultimate goal? By renewing that vow day after day, we'll have more energy and more determination to consistently engage in this systematic approach to studying the Dharma. So in the following videos that I'll be putting out on this channel, I hope to get into more detail about how to engage in this practice and study. In particular, how to better learn from the sutras and the commentaries of the ancient teachers as well as modern teachers, so that we have a clear structure of the concepts, the theory behind the practice. Because from what I've seen, there's really just not too much information in English, so I hope to organize a bit of that structure of the Buddha Dharma theory and various lines of thought of Buddhism to help you have a clear direction of where you can start. So I hope this video was helpful. I'd be interested to hear your comments and feedback. And in the meantime, practice wisely.